On December 10th, 1928, a nurse was found dead inside room 502 of Waverly Hills Sanatorium. She had worked the tuberculosis ward for years, tending to patients who coughed blood into cloth masks and died one by one in their beds. When staff broke open the locked door that morning, her body was suspended from the ceiling light fixture, her white shoes neatly placed on the floor beneath her swaying feet. Hospital records listed the death as suicide by hanging. No investigation followed. But within weeks, other nurses began hearing a woman crying behind the locked door of room 502. Patients in nearby beds reported a figure in a white uniform standing at the foot of their beds just before dawn, whispering their names in the darkness. And nearly a century later, visitors to the abandoned sanatorium still feel unseen hands shove them backward in that room, still hear that same woman weeping, as if something there is furious that it was never allowed to leave. The Foundation. Louisville, Kentucky, in the year 1910. Tuberculosis was killing 1 out of every 7 Americans. The White Plague, they called it. Consumption. The disease that made you waste away while you drowned in your own blood. Cities were graveyards. Families watched their children cough themselves to death in airless tenement rooms. There was no cure, no treatment, only isolation and hope. Waverly Hills Sanatorium was built on that hope. The building rose on a remote hilltop south of Louisville, designed by the most progressive architects of the era. 2 stories tall initially, built in the Tudor Gothic style with sweeping verandas and enormous windows. The theory was simple. Fresh air, sunlight, and rest would cure the incurable. Patients would sleep on open-air porches even in winter. They would breathe the clean hilltop winds. They would heal. The original structure opened on July 26, 1910, with capacity for 40 patients. Photographs from that first year show nurses in crisp white uniforms standing beside hopeful families. The building gleams in the sunlight. The patients smile for the camera, blankets wrapped around their shoulders, their faces thin but optimistic. Within 2 years, every bed was full. Within 5 years, they were stacking patients in hallways. By 1924, the epidemic had grown so severe that the original building was completely inadequate. Construction began on a massive expansion, a 5-story medical fortress designed to house more than 400 patients. The new Waverly Hills opened in October of 1926. It was the most advanced tuberculosis hospital in the country. State-of-the-art solariums, surgical theaters, a rooftop garden where patients could take the air. It was also a death factory. There was still no cure. The treatments were experimental and brutal. Pneumothorax procedures collapsed patients' lungs deliberately, forcing them to rest while infection, hopefully cleared. It rarely worked. Thoracoplasty removed ribs to collapse the chest cavity. Patients survived the surgery only to suffocate slowly over months. In the most desperate cases, doctors performed phrenic nerve operations, paralyzing the diaphragm to immobilize the lung. The patients screamed during these procedures. Anesthesia was limited. Many died on the operating table. Most died in their beds weeks later, drowning in fluid and blood. At the peak of the epidemic, between 1930 and 1935, 1 person died at Waverly Hills nearly every hour. The body count exceeded 63,000 over the sanatorium's 51 years of operation. Death became routine. Nurses learned to recognize the sound of the final breath, that wet, rattling gasp. They learned to close the eyes quickly before rigor mortis set in. They learned not to learn the patients' names. But the living patients were a problem. Hospital administrators realized that watching cart after cart of shrouded bodies wheeled past their windows was destroying morale. The dying did not need to watch the dead. So in 1928, during the worst years of mortality, they constructed a solution. A tunnel, 500 feet long, sloping downward from the main hospital building to the bottom of the hill, wide enough for a gurney, concrete floor, concrete walls, a single rail track running down the center. The official purpose was supply delivery. Coal and food went up, but everyone knew what came down: bodies. The staff called it the body chute, the death tunnel. Every day, sometimes multiple times per day, orderlies would load the dead onto carts and roll them down through the darkness. The tunnel exited at the base of the hill where hearses waited, out of sight, out of mind. The patients upstairs never had to watch their future leave the building. The tunnel opened in March of 1928. In April, the first staff reports appeared in the hospital's internal logs. Night shift orderlies reported hearing footsteps in the tunnel when no one was there. The sound of wheels rolling on the track, echoing up from the darkness long after the last body transport had finished. One orderly, a man named Robert Elkins, wrote in his incident report that he heard someone coughing in the tunnel at 2 a.m. When he went down with a flashlight, he found the space empty, but the coughing continued. It seemed to come from inside the concrete walls themselves. His supervisor noted the report and filed it away. There were more important concerns. People were dying faster than they could be processed. By summer, the reports multiplied. Nurses on the 4th floor heard dragging sounds from the tunnel entrance at night. A maintenance worker refused to enter the tunnel alone after seeing a shadow figure standing at the bottom that vanished when he approached. The hospital chaplain, Father Michael Donovan, was called to bless the tunnel in August after 3 separate staff members reported feeling watched while transporting bodies. The blessing changed nothing. In September of 1928, a nurse named Lily Haverford began working the overnight shift in the tuberculosis ward on the 5th floor. She was 29 years old, single, dedicated to her work. According to employment records, she had been at Waverly Hills for 6 years, working primarily with the most severe cases, the patients who had weeks or days left. Room 502 was at the end of the hall, a double occupancy room with large windows facing west. Patients in that room rarely survived more than a month. Nurse Haverford attended to them all. She changed their bedding. She held their hands when they coughed blood. She was there when they died, which was often. On the morning of December 10th, 1928, she did not report for the end of her shift. Her supervisor found the door to room 502 locked from the inside. Both patients who had occupied the room had died days earlier. Their bodies had already been removed. The room was supposed to be empty. When the supervisor knocked, there was no answer. When she used her master key, the lock would not turn. Maintenance was called. They broke the door. Nurse Lily Haverford hung from the light fixture in the center of the room. A bedsheet twisted around her neck. Her white nurse's shoes placed neatly on the floor below her feet, side by side, toes pointing toward the window. Her hands were at her sides. Her eyes were open. The hospital director listed the death as suicide due to work-related stress. No police investigation was opened. Nurse Haverford was buried 3 days later in a private ceremony. The hospital sealed the room for 2 weeks, then reopened it for patients. And then the nurses began hearing her. The first report came from a nurse named Catherine Mills, working the same overnight shift Lily Haverford had worked. She heard a woman crying behind the door of room 502 at 3 a.m. Soft at first, then building to hysterical sobbing. When she opened the door, the room was empty. The crying stopped the moment the door opened. It happened again the following week, and the week after that. Always between 2 and 4 in the morning. Always the same sound. A woman weeping as if her heart was breaking. Patients began complaining. A man in room 501, the room directly adjacent, told his doctor he could not sleep because a woman kept crying through the wall. He died 2 days later. His replacement reported the same thing. And the next patient. And the next. Then came the sightings. A patient named Thomas Brennan, recovering from thoracoplasty surgery, woke at dawn to find a woman in a white nurse's uniform standing at the foot of his bed. She was staring at him. When he tried to speak, she whispered his name. Thomas. Just once. Then she turned and walked toward the door. He called for help. When the day shift nurse arrived, the room was empty. The door was still locked from the outside. Thomas Brennan died of surgical complications 6 days later. The pattern repeated. Different patients. Same room. A woman in white standing at the foot of the bed just before dawn, whispering their names. Every patient who reported seeing her died within a week. The hospital stopped assigning patients to room 502 in 1931. It remained empty for 2 years, but the crying continued. And the footsteps. Nurses heard someone walking in the room at night, back and forth, as if pacing. In July of 1933, a hospital administrator named Gerald Hodge, who did not believe in ghosts and considered the stories to be mass hysteria, decided to spend the night in room 502 to prove nothing was there. He locked himself inside at 10 in the evening. Staff heard him pacing for the first hour, then silence. At 6 in the morning, when he did not emerge, they opened the door. Gerald Hodge lay on the floor beneath the window. His skull was fractured. Blood pooled around his head. The window was open. Hospital records stated he fell while attempting to close the window. But the window opened inward, not outward. And there were bruises on his shoulders, as if he had been pushed. No one ever spent the night in room 502 again. The pattern emerges. Waverly Hills operated for another 28 years after Gerald Hodge died. Tuberculosis treatment improved gradually through the 1940s with the development of antibiotic therapy. The death rate dropped. By the 1950s, the disease was largely controllable. The sanatorium's patient population declined, but the phenomena did not. The pattern became clear to anyone who worked there long enough. Specific locations produced specific events. The death tunnel, room 502, the surgical wing, the 4th floor solarium. These places had absorbed something during the worst years, something that did not fade when the dying stopped. The death tunnel remained the epicenter. Maintenance worker James Pritchard worked at Waverly Hills from 1948 until the hospital closed in 1961. In a 1998 interview with paranormal researcher Donna Feltz, he described his experiences in the tunnel across 13 years. The dragging sound was constant, he said. You would be walking down the tunnel, and you would hear something heavy being pulled along the concrete behind you. When you turned around, nothing was there. But you could feel the air move. You could hear it scraping. Temperature drops were common. The tunnel would be 50 degrees. Then you would walk through a pocket of air so cold your breath turned white. These pockets appeared in the same locations every time. 40 feet down from the entrance. 90 feet down. At the very bottom where the tunnel opened to the outside. Voices were the worst, Pritchard said. You would hear someone calling for help, not screaming, just calling weakly, the way the patients used to call when they needed a nurse. please, help me, over and over. But when you searched, there was no one. Other workers reported identical experiences. A janitor named William Cross heard coughing in the tunnel every night he worked the closing shift from 1952 to 1955. Wet, rattling coughs that echoed off the concrete. He would walk the entire length of the tunnel with a flashlight, checking every corner. Empty. But the coughing continued. An electrician named Robert Hammond, hired to upgrade the lighting system in 1957, refused to finish the job. He told the hospital director he felt hands grabbing at his ankles while he worked on the ladder. He could not see anyone, but he felt fingers wrapping around his legs, tugging downward. He climbed down and walked out. He never returned. The pattern held across decades. Different people, different years. Same phenomena, same locations. Room 502 followed its own rhythm. After the hospital stopped housing patients in the room, it was used for storage. Medical supplies, old records, furniture from closed wards. Staff avoided entering unless absolutely necessary. Those who did reported consistent experiences. The temperature in room 502 was always at least 15 degrees colder than the hallway outside, even in summer, even with the windows closed. Thermal imaging conducted in 2006 by paranormal investigative team, the Atlantic Paranormal Society, confirmed this. The room maintained an average temperature of 58 degrees, while the surrounding rooms measured 74 degrees. There was no mechanical explanation. The crying continued. Security guards working overnight shifts in the 1980s and 1990s all reported hearing a woman sobbing in room 502 between 2 and 4 in the morning. The sound was loud enough to echo down the hallway. Multiple guards filed incident reports. Some requested reassignment. Others quit. Physical contact became common. Night watchman Daniel Torres worked security at Waverly Hills in 1993 when the building was abandoned and undergoing potential renovation assessments. He entered room 502 on a routine patrol at 11:45 one night in October. He felt someone shove him hard from behind. He stumbled forward and fell against the wall. When he turned around, the room was empty. He left immediately and never went back to that floor alone. Construction worker Anthony Martinez experienced the same thing in 2001. He was measuring the windows in room 502 for potential replacement when he felt hands on his shoulders, pushing him toward the window. He spun around. No one there. He walked out and refused to continue work in that room. The hands left bruises. Martinez documented the bruising with photographs taken that same day. 4 distinct finger marks on each shoulder, dark purple against his skin. He had them examined by a physician who confirmed they were consistent with someone grabbing him forcefully from behind. But the most disturbing pattern was the intelligence behind the activity. Paranormal investigator Keith Age has led more than 40 overnight investigations at Waverly Hills since 2004. In a 2012 interview, he described how the phenomena respond to investigators. When we ask questions in room 502, we get answers, he said. Not always, but often enough to establish communication. We use digital recorders to capture electronic voice phenomena. We ask, "What is your name?" We ask, "How did you die?" We ask, "Why are you still here?" The recordings capture responses. In March of 2009, Age's team recorded a female voice responding to the question, "What happened to you?" The voice, barely audible beneath static, said, "He pushed me." When they asked who pushed you, there was no further response. But the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees in under 30 seconds. 3 team members reported feeling suddenly dizzy and nauseous. The investigation ended early when one team member, a woman named Sarah Chen began crying uncontrollably. She could not explain why. She simply felt overwhelming grief that she could not control. She had to leave the building. This happened repeatedly across multiple investigations. Different teams, different investigators. Same room. Sudden emotional distress with no psychological trigger. The feeling of devastating sadness that appeared without warning and vanished the moment they left the room. Other rooms developed their own signatures. The fourth-floor solarium, where patients took sun therapy, produced consistent shadow figure sightings. Multiple investigators using infrared cameras captured dark humanoid shapes moving across the windows, clearly visible on film, despite nothing being present to the naked eye. The shadows moved with purpose, walking from one end of the solarium to the other, then vanishing. The surgical wing on the second floor was known for the sound of screaming. Investigators recorded high-pitched screaming coming from the sealed operating rooms on multiple occasions between 2005 and 2010. The rooms had been empty for over 40 years. There was no source for the sound. Audio analysis confirmed the screams were human, not mechanical or animal. They lasted between 5 and 12 seconds, then stopped abruptly. But the death tunnel remained the location where the most consistent and terrifying phenomena occurred. In October of 2007, a team of 15 investigators from the Louisville Ghost Hunter Society conducted a synchronized investigation of the tunnel. They positioned investigators at 3 points: the entrance at the top, the midpoint 150 feet down, and the exit at the bottom. All 3 groups were in radio contact. All 3 groups had multiple witnesses and recording equipment. At 1:23 in the morning, the group at the bottom of the tunnel reported seeing a dark figure moving up the slope toward them. It was human-shaped, but indistinct, like a shadow cast by a person who was not there. The figure moved against gravity, walking upward on the sloped floor as if the ground were level. The middle group reported seeing the same figure pass through their position approximately 30 seconds later. It did not acknowledge them. It simply walked past, continuing upward. The group at the top entrance never saw the figure arrive. It vanished somewhere between the middle position and the top. But at 1:27 in the morning, all 15 investigators reported simultaneous respiratory distress, difficulty breathing, tightness in the chest, the sensation of fluid in the lungs. Several people began coughing. 2 investigators had to be helped out of the tunnel. Medical evaluation found nothing wrong with any of them. Their lungs were clear. Their oxygen levels were normal. But the feeling of suffocation was real and shared. One investigator, a physician named Marcus Webb, described the sensation in his written report. "It felt like drowning," he wrote, "like my lungs were filling with liquid. I could not get enough air. And then the moment I stepped outside the tunnel, it stopped. Completely. Like a switch had been flipped." The Louisville Ghost Hunters Society has never returned to Waverly Hills. The pattern was undeniable. Repetition across time, consistency across witnesses, the same sounds, the same figures, the same rooms. Whatever haunted Waverly Hills was not random. It was systematic, it was structured, and it was still active. The peak horror. Waverly Hills Sanatorium closed its doors on June 30th, 1961. Tuberculosis had been conquered. The patients were transferred to other facilities. The staff dispersed. The building stood empty on its hilltop, windows dark, doors chained. It did not stay empty for long. In 1962, the building reopened as Woodhaven Geriatrics Hospital, a nursing home for the elderly. It operated until 1982, under conditions that became increasingly controversial. Allegations of patient neglect surfaced throughout the 1970s. Reports of insufficient staffing, inadequate medical care, and questionable treatment practices. The state of Kentucky conducted multiple investigations, but the staff reported something else, something the investigations never addressed. The phenomena escalated. Nurses working overnight shifts at Woodhaven reported the same experiences their predecessors had reported decades earlier: crying from room 502, footsteps in the death tunnel, shadow figures in the hallways. But the activity was more frequent, more aggressive. One nurse, Beverly Thompson, worked at Woodhaven from 1976 to 1981. In a 2003 interview, she described an incident from August of 1978. She was distributing medication on the 4th floor at approximately 10 in the evening. The hallway was empty. The patients were in their rooms. She heard footsteps behind her, heavy, deliberate. She turned around. Nothing. The footsteps continued, getting closer. She could hear them clearly. Boot heels on the tile floor. She backed against the wall. The footsteps stopped directly in front of her. Then she felt breath on her face. Warm, wet, the smell of decay. She could not see anyone, but she felt someone standing inches from her face, breathing on her. She ran. She left her medication cart in the hallway and ran for the stairwell. When other staff members arrived, the medication cart had been overturned. Pills scattered across the floor. No one had been in the hallway. Beverly Thompson requested transfer to another facility the following week. The stories multiplied, but they remained local. Whispers among staff, urban legends among Louisville teenagers who dared each other to break into the abandoned upper floors. Waverly Hills was haunted, everyone said, but it was contained. It was isolated on its hilltop. It could be avoided. Then national attention arrived. After Woodhaven closed in 1982, the building sat abandoned for 2 decades. Vandalism was rampant. Graffiti covered the walls. Windows were shattered. The structure began to decay. In 2001, a couple named Charlie and Tina Mattingly purchased the property with the intent to preserve it. They began offering historical tours. And then, in 2003, they allowed paranormal investigators inside. The investigations were filmed, broadcast, shared online. And the world watched Waverly Hills fight back. The television show Ghost Hunters filmed an episode at Waverly Hills in October of 2005. The episode documented what the team described as one of the most active locations they had ever investigated. Multiple EVP recordings, shadow figure sightings, unexplained equipment malfunctions. But the most striking moment came in the death tunnel. Investigator Grant Wilson was walking through the tunnel with a cameraman when he reported feeling something grab his arm. The footage shows him react, pulling his arm away sharply. He asks, "Did you see that?" The cameraman confirms nothing visible touched him, but Wilson insists he felt fingers wrapping around his bicep. When he examines his arm on camera, there are red marks forming, finger-shaped impressions. The footage is unedited. The marks are visible. A separate investigation in 2006 produced even more disturbing documentation. The television show Ghost Adventures spent a night locked inside Waverly Hills. During their investigation of room 502, host Zach Bagans reported being scratched. The footage shows him reacting in pain, lifting his shirt to reveal 3 parallel scratch marks across his lower back. Fresh, bleeding slightly. He had been standing alone in the center of the room when it occurred. The crew evacuated the room immediately. Skeptic investigator Joe Nickel visited Waverly Hills in 2008 specifically to debunk the paranormal claims. He spent 3 hours in the building, focusing on room 502 and the death tunnel. His intention was to demonstrate that the phenomena could be explained through environmental factors, suggestion, and misinterpretation. He left after 90 minutes. In his published report, Nickel acknowledged experiencing events he could not immediately explain. He reported feeling sudden temperature drops in the death tunnel that his equipment confirmed. He heard sounds he described as consistent with human footsteps, despite being alone in the corridor. Most troubling to him was an experience in room 502 where he felt, in his words, an overwhelming sense of being unwanted. A psychological pressure to leave that intensified the longer he remained. He did not conclude the building was haunted, but he did not offer an explanation for what he experienced. The most dramatic incident occurred in March of 2009 during a private overnight investigation led by paranormal researcher Michel Belanger. Belanger's team of 8 investigators was conducting an EVP session in the death tunnel at approximately 2 a.m. They were positioned at the midpoint of the tunnel, recording equipment active, flashlights off to enhance audio quality. They had been asking questions for approximately 15 minutes when one investigator, a man named David Herrera, reported feeling hands on his ankles. The team turned on their flashlights. Herrera was sitting on the floor, back against the wall. He said he felt fingers wrapping around both ankles, squeezing. He tried to pull his legs away, but the grip was too strong. He was being pulled, slowly, toward the center of the tunnel. 2 team members grabbed his arms. They pulled him back. Whatever had his ankles released suddenly. Herrera scrambled to his feet. The team evacuated the tunnel immediately. Later examination of the audio recording from that session captured something none of them had heard in real time. A voice, male, barely audible beneath the ambient sound. It said, "Stay." The investigation ended that night. Michel Belanger's team has not returned. Over the following years, multiple attempts were made to cleanse the building. In 2010, a Catholic priest was brought in to perform a blessing of the entire structure. He blessed each floor systematically, starting with the basement and working upward. He blessed the death tunnel. He blessed room 502. He conducted mass in the old chapel. The blessing took 6 hours. For 3 weeks, paranormal activity decreased noticeably. Investigators reported fewer phenomena. The building felt quieter, less oppressive. Then the activity returned, more intense than before. Witnesses reported hearing angry voices in the tunnels, objects being thrown in empty rooms. Physical contact became more frequent and more violent. One investigator was shoved down a stairwell and sustained a sprained wrist. Another reported being grabbed by the throat in the 4th floor hallway, leaving visible hand-shaped bruises. A second blessing was attempted in 2012 by a Protestant minister. The result was the same: temporary calm, then escalation. A paranormal research team specializing in cleansing rituals performed a complex spiritual clearing in 2014. They used sage. They used salt barriers. They used prayers from multiple religious traditions. They attempted to seal the most active areas and redirect the energy. The activity did not stop. It relocated. Phenomena that had been concentrated in room 502 began appearing in other rooms on the 5th floor. The death tunnel activity spread to the basement corridors. Shadow figures previously seen only in the solarium were reported throughout the building. It was adapting. This was the realization that changed how investigators understood Waverly Hills. The haunting was not a collection of isolated spirits trapped in specific locations. It was a system, an intelligence, something that learned and responded and refused to be controlled. Medical historians offered context. Dr. Marianne Watley, a professor of medical history at the University of Louisville, examined the documentation in 2015. Her conclusion was measured but disturbing. Waverly Hills was a site of prolonged mass trauma, she stated in an interview. Over 63,000 people died there across 5 decades. Most of them died slowly, painfully, in isolation from their families. The building absorbed that suffering in ways we do not fully understand. Whether you believe in the paranormal or not, the psychological and emotional residue of that much death is undeniable. But she could not explain the physical phenomena. The scratches, the voices, the hands in the darkness. No one could. The legacy and unresolved terror Waverly Hills Sanatorium stands on its hilltop today, a monument preserved by the Mattingly family and maintained through tours and investigations. It is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It is recognized as one of the most haunted locations in America. Hundreds of paranormal investigative teams have documented phenomena within its walls. The activity continues. Recent reports mirror those from a century ago with disturbing precision. In 2021, a team from the Paranormal Research Society conducted a 3-night investigation focusing on the Death Tunnel. Using advanced audio equipment, thermal imaging cameras, and EMF detectors, they documented consistent patterns. Temperature anomalies in the same locations previous investigators had reported. Shadow figures captured on infrared moving through the tunnel at consistent intervals. EVP recordings containing voices saying the same phrases captured decades apart. "Help me. It hurts. Let me out." The voices sound the same across different recording equipment, different years, different investigators. Same cadence, same tone, same desperation. Room 502 remains the most active location in the building. In August of 2023, investigator Amanda Greer spent 4 hours alone in the room as part of a solo investigation challenge. She lasted 90 minutes. According to her published account, she experienced all the classic phenomena: the temperature drop, the sound of crying, the feeling of being watched. But what forced her to leave was something more specific. She heard her name whispered directly into her ear. "Amanda," the voice said, "you need to leave." She was wearing recording equipment. The whisper was not captured, but she felt breath on her neck. Warm, real. She left the room immediately and has stated publicly she will never return. The pattern of names continues. Multiple investigators across multiple years have reported hearing their names spoken by unseen voices in room 502. Always whispered, always intimate, always a warning or a command. Current analysis suggests the phenomena at Waverly Hills represent something beyond traditional ghost theories. Dr. Richard Estep, a paranormal researcher and author, has investigated Waverly Hills more than 30 times since 2007. His conclusion, published in 2022, proposes that the building itself has become a kind of recording medium. The limestone and concrete absorbed the emotional and physical trauma of mass death over decades. What investigators experience is not necessarily individual spirits, but an imprint, a playback, residual energy that manifests with apparent intelligence because it is responding to the patterns of the living people who enter the space. But this theory does not explain the physical attacks. Residual hauntings do not scratch people. They do not grab ankles. They do not whisper names. Other researchers propose the site is host to multiple forms of haunting simultaneously. Residual impressions playing on loop, intelligent spirits of individuals who died traumatic deaths, and possibly something else. Something that developed from the accumulated suffering. An entity formed not from a single death, but from thousands of deaths happening in the same location over years. This is the theory that disturbs even the most experienced investigators. The idea that prolonged mass suffering can create something new, something that did not exist before the deaths began, but exists now because the deaths happened. A spiritual ecosystem born from trauma. Whatever the explanation, the evidence is consistent. Waverly Hills is not quiet. The deaths that saturated the building have not faded. The nurses still cry in room 502. The bodies still move through the death tunnel. The patients still call for help from inside the walls. And the building remembers. In October of 2024, the most recent major investigation was conducted by a coalition of university researchers and paranormal investigators. They spent 5 nights documenting phenomena using scientific methodology, controlled conditions, multiple witnesses, redundant recording systems. Their goal was to gather enough evidence to establish whether Waverly Hills could be studied as a genuine scientific anomaly. The results were released in March of 2025. The team confirmed consistent anomalous phenomena that could not be explained through current environmental or psychological models. They documented intelligent responses to questions. They recorded temperature variations without mechanical cause. They captured audio of voices speaking coherent phrases in empty rooms. But their most significant finding was the pattern analysis. By comparing reports across 75 years, from the hospital's operating period through modern investigations, the team identified exact repetitions. Same phenomena, same locations, same descriptions. Witnesses separated by decades reporting identical experiences with identical details. The nurse in white at the foot of the bed in room 502. The dragging sound at 40 feet into the death tunnel. The shadow figure walking uphill. The crying between 2 and 4 in the morning. These are not variations. They are repetitions. Something is playing the same events over and over. Or something is trapped in the same actions over and over. The distinction may not matter. The investigation concluded with a statement that has become the defining summary of Waverly Hills. We cannot determine what causes the phenomena, the team wrote, but we can confirm the phenomena are real, consistent, and ongoing. Waverly Hills Sanatorium remains an active site of unexplained events that warrant continued study and documentation. The Mattingly family continues to preserve the building and allow controlled access. They have heard every story. They have witnessed phenomena themselves. They maintain that Waverly Hills deserves respect. The people who died there deserve to be remembered. Whether the haunting is literal or psychological or some combination, the building stands as a memorial to suffering. And suffering, it seems, does not simply vanish when the suffering stops. The death tunnel stretches 500 feet into darkness beneath Waverly Hills Sanatorium tonight, exactly as it did when the first body was wheeled down its sloped concrete floor in March of 1928. The walls are the same. The cold is the same. And if you stand in that tunnel in the hours before dawn, you will hear what generations of workers and investigators have heard. Footsteps, voices, the sound of something being dragged slowly through the dark. Waverly Hills asks a question that medicine cannot answer and science has not resolved. Does prolonged mass death create something that transcends individual ghosts? Can suffering accumulate in stone and concrete and wood until the building itself becomes a living record of trauma? And if so, can that record ever be erased? The evidence suggests it cannot. 63,000 people died in that building. They died slowly. They died afraid. They died isolated from the world, breathing recycled air on a hilltop above a city that had quarantined them. Their bodies went down the tunnel. Their suffering stayed in the rooms. And now, a century later, the rooms remember. The nurse still hangs in room 502. The patients still call from their beds. The tunnel still moves its invisible cargo downward in the dark. Waverly Hills was built as a sanctuary for healing. It became an engine of death. And death, it appears, is not something a building forgets. Perhaps the question is not whether Waverly Hills is haunted. Perhaps the question is whether a place where that much suffering occurred could ever be anything else. The tunnel remains open. The doors remain unlocked. The building stands on its hill, waiting. And inside, in the darkness between the walls, something continues the work it began 100 years ago, remembering, repeating, refusing to rest.